The Wyoming wind howled like a wounded animal across the barren landscape, carrying with it the scent of rain and something else, something that spoke of ancient grudges and blood spilled on sacred ground. Samuel Hayes pulled his coat tighter as he stepped onto his porch, his weathered hands gripping the rifle that had been his constant companion for 23 years on this unforgiving frontier. In the distance, lightning split the sky like God's own judgment, illuminating a figure stumbling through the mud toward his property. At 52, Samuel had learned that strangers in storms brought nothing but trouble. But as the figure collapsed just yards from his fence, and he caught sight of long black hair plastered against a woman's face, something stirred in his chest, a feeling he thought had died with his wife and daughter 5 winters past. Will Samuel's act of mercy bridge a divide that has torn apart 2 worlds? Stay with us as we uncover a story of unexpected grace, where a single night of kindness echoes across generations, proving that sometimes the smallest gestures carry the greatest power to heal even the deepest wounds. The storm that swept across the Wyoming Territory that October evening in 1887 came without warning, as if the very heavens had conspired to test every soul brave enough to call this harsh land home. Samuel Hayes stood at his kitchen window, watching the rain assault his modest ranch with the kind of violence that reminded him why so many had given up and headed back east. The coffee in his tin cup had grown cold hours ago, but he held onto it anyway. Sometimes a man needed something familiar in his hands when the world outside seemed bent on tearing itself apart. At 52, Samuel had weathered more storms than he cared to count, both the kind that came from angry skies and the kind that came from angry men. His face bore the evidence of both, deep lines carved by wind and sun, a scar along his left temple from a Cheyenne arrow that had come too close for comfort during the troubles of '76, and eyes that had seen too much death to ever fully trust in peace again. The ranch itself was modest by territorial standards, 300 acres of stubborn grass and equally stubborn cattle, a 2-room cabin he'd built with his own hands, and a barn that had somehow survived everything nature and man had thrown at it. It wasn't much, but it was his, bought with blood and sweat and the kind of determination that turned ordinary men into legends in these parts. Samuel's nearest neighbor lived 12 miles to the south, which suited him just fine. After losing his wife Margaret to consumption and his 8-year-old daughter Emma to scarlet fever in the same terrible winter of 1882, he discovered that solitude was easier than sympathy. People meant well with their casseroles and their careful words, but grief was something a man had to wrestle with alone, like Jacob wrestling with the angel, except sometimes the angel won. The lightning came first, splitting the sky with such brilliance that for a moment the night became day, revealing the landscape in stark, unforgiving detail. Thunder followed, rolling across the prairie like cannon fire, rattling the windows and setting his old dog Rex to whimpering under the kitchen table. Samuel absently reached down to scratch behind the animal's ears, a gesture so automatic he barely registered it. It was during the next lightning flash that he saw her. At first, his mind refused to process what his eyes were telling him. A figure, human-shaped but moving wrong, stumbling through the mud with the desperate gait of someone fighting to stay upright. The distance made details impossible, but something about the way the person moved, a particular vulnerability in their posture, made Samuel's chest tighten with recognition of suffering. Another lightning strike confirmed what the first had suggested. It was a woman, and she was in serious trouble. Samuel set down his coffee cup and moved toward the door, his rifle following his hand, with the practiced ease of a man who'd learned that caution kept you breathing. He paused at the threshold, hand on the latch, as 23 years of frontier wisdom warred with something deeper and more primitive, the part of him that remembered his mother's voice reading from the good book about entertaining angels unaware. The wind grabbed the door from his hands as he opened it, slamming it back against the cabin wall with enough force to crack the wood. Rain struck his face like cold needles, and he had to lean into the storm just to keep his footing. Rex whined from inside, but didn't follow. The dog had more sense than his master, apparently. "Hello!" Samuel shouted into the wind, his voice swallowed almost before it left his throat. "You there, can you hear me?" The figure stumbled again, went to one knee in the mud, struggled up and continued forward. She was close enough now that the next lightning flash revealed details that made Samuel's breath catch. long black hair streaming with rainwater, dark skin and clothing that marked her as Native American, Cheyenne or Sioux most likely, though the storm made certainty impossible. Every instinct Samuel had developed during his years on the frontier screamed at him to go back inside, bar the door, and wait for morning. The wars with the tribes were supposed to be over. Red Cloud had signed his treaty. Crazy Horse was dead, and even Sitting Bull had finally surrendered. But peace on paper didn't always translate to peace on the ground. A lone Indian woman stumbling onto his property in the middle of a storm could be anything from a lost soul to the advance scout for a war party looking for revenge. But as the woman collapsed again, this time struggling longer to rise, Samuel found himself moving off his porch and into the storm without consciously deciding to do so. Some impulses ran deeper than wisdom, and the sight of another human being in distress had always been one of them. The mud sucked at his boots as he made his way across the yard, the storm doing its best to blind and deafen him. The woman was maybe 30 yards from his fence when he reached her, and up close the extent of her condition became clear. She was young, maybe 25, and beautiful in the way that seemed to transcend race or circumstance. But she was also exhausted to the point of collapse, soaked to the bone, and shivering so violently that Samuel could see it even in the intermittent lightning. "Ma'am," he said, having to shout to be heard over the wind. "Ma'am, can you understand me?" She looked up at him, and for a moment their eyes met in the next lightning flash. Hers were dark brown, almost black, and filled with a mixture of defiance and desperation that Samuel recognized from his own mirror during the worst of times. She said something in what he assumed was Cheyenne, the words lost in the storm, but the tone unmistakably proud despite her circumstances. Samuel made a decision that would change both their lives forever. He slung his rifle across his back and reached down to help her up. She flinched at first, her hand moving instinctively towards something at her belt, a knife probably, but when he kept his movements slow and non-threatening, she allowed him to take her arm. "Come on," he said, supporting more of her weight than he'd expected to. "Barn's warm and dry." She spoke again in her own language, but this time there was something different in her tone. Surprise, perhaps, or maybe just gratitude. Samuel didn't try to respond. He simply guided her through the storm toward the barn, both of them fighting for every step against the wind and rain. The barn was a sanctuary after the violence of the storm outside. Samuel's 3 horses whickered softly from their stalls, and the familiar smells of hay and leather and honest animal sweat created an atmosphere of safety that seemed to relax the woman immediately. She was still shivering, but the desperate edge to it had eased. Samuel lit a kerosene lamp hanging by the door, and in its warm glow he got his first clear look at his unexpected guest. She was definitely Cheyenne. He could tell by her clothing and the particular way she wore her hair, and she was in worse shape than he'd realized. Her buckskin dress was torn in several places, and there were scratches on her arms that looked like they'd come from thorns or rough rocks. She'd been traveling hard and long before the storm found her. "You're safe here," he said, knowing she probably didn't understand the words, but hoping she'd catch the meaning in his tone. "Nobody's going to hurt you." She looked around the barn with the careful attention of someone assessing potential threats and escape routes, then said something in Cheyenne that sounded like a question. Samuel pointed to himself. "Samuel," he said. "Samuel Hayes." She nodded, then touched her chest. "Ayanna," she said, the name musical despite everything. "Ayanna," Samuel repeated, and she smiled slightly, the first smile he'd seen from her, small but genuine. He found horse blankets and made her a bed in the hay, far enough from the animals to give her privacy, but close enough to benefit from their warmth. She accepted his help with a dignity that impressed him. No groveling or excessive gratitude, just the quiet acceptance of one person acknowledging another's kindness. As Samuel prepared to leave her for the night, Ayanna spoke again in Cheyenne, longer this time, her voice carrying what sounded like formal cadences. She might have been thanking him or blessing him, or simply explaining her circumstances. He couldn't tell. But when she finished, she looked directly into his eyes and nodded once, a gesture that somehow conveyed more meaning than any words could have. "Get some rest," Samuel said. "Morning will bring better weather." As he walked back to his cabin through the continuing storm, Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just set something momentous in motion. But whether that something would prove to be blessing or curse, only dawn would tell. Samuel woke before dawn, as was his habit, but this morning felt different from the 1,000 mornings that had preceded it. The storm had passed sometime in the night, leaving behind that peculiar prairie silence that followed violence. Too quiet, as if the land itself was holding its breath. He lay in his narrow bed for a moment, staring at the rough-hewn ceiling beams, and remembered. The woman, Ayana. Rex stirred from his place by the dying fire, tail thumping once against the floor in greeting, but without his usual morning enthusiasm. Even the dog seemed to sense that this was no ordinary day. Samuel pulled on his clothes and boots, strapped on his gun belt, and stepped outside into the pre-dawn darkness. The air was crisp and clean, washed by the storm, and the first hints of grey were beginning to creep across the eastern horizon. Samuel made his way across the muddy yard toward the barn, his footsteps seeming unnaturally loud in the stillness. He wasn't sure what he expected to find. Part of him wondered if the whole thing had been some fever dream brought on by too much solitude and too little human contact. But when he eased open the barn door, there she was. Ayana sat with her back against a hay bale, wide awake and watching the door with the alert stillness of someone accustomed to danger. Her dark hair had dried overnight into long waves that caught the lamplight, and her buckskin dress, though still stained and torn, had regained some of its original dignity. She looked younger in the gentle light, maybe not even 25, Samuel thought, but her eyes held the kind of old wisdom that came from surviving things that would break lesser souls. "Morning," Samuel said softly, not wanting to startle her. "Morning?" she replied in accented but clear English, and Samuel felt his eyebrows rise in surprise. "You speak English?" "Some." She rose gracefully to her feet, every movement economical and purposeful. "Mission school. Long time ago." Samuel nodded, understanding more than she'd said. The government schools were infamous for their attempts to civilize Indian children, often by forcing them away from their families and forbidding them to speak their native languages. That she'd managed to retain both English and her evident cultural identity spoke to a strength of character that impressed him. "You hungry?" he asked. Ayana hesitated, pride warring with obvious need, then nodded once. "Come on up to the house. I'll make coffee and eggs." She followed him across the yard, moving with the kind of unconscious grace that made Samuel think of deer or antelope, creatures built for swift flight across difficult terrain. At the cabin door, she paused and looked around carefully, taking in the defensive positions, the sight lines, the escape routes. Old habits, Samuel thought, hard-learned and harder to break. Inside, she stood uncertainly near the door while Samuel built up the fire and started coffee. The cabin was simple but clean, one main room that served as kitchen, dining area and parlor, with a bedroom off to one side. Margaret's touch was still visible in the curtains she'd sewn and the wildflowers painted on the cabinet doors, though Samuel had packed away most of her more personal belongings after she died. "Sit," Samuel said, gesturing toward the rough wooden table. "Please." Ayana remained standing until he'd finished with the coffee and eggs and sat down himself. Only then did she take the chair across from him, her back to the wall and her eyes never straying far from the door. She ate slowly, with obvious hunger, but also with the careful manners that spoke of good upbringing and natural dignity. "Where are you from?" Samuel asked, keeping his voice conversational. "North," she said, which could have meant anywhere from the Dakotas to Canada. "Family." Her hands stilled on her cup, and for a moment, something raw and painful flickered across her face. "Gone," she said simply. Samuel understood that kind of loss, the way it hollowed you out and left you walking through life like a ghost of yourself. He didn't press for details. "You're welcome to stay until you figure out where you're going," he said instead. "Weather's turning cold. Won't be fit for traveling soon." Ayana looked at him with something like surprise. "Why?" she asked. It was a fair question. Why would a white rancher offer shelter to a lone Indian woman in 1887 Wyoming, where the memory of Custer's last stand was still fresh and the frontier wars were barely cold? Samuel had been asking himself the same question since the moment he'd stepped into that storm. "Lost my wife and daughter a few years back," he said finally. "Learned something about being alone in the world. Wouldn't wish it on anybody." She studied his face with those dark, intelligent eyes, as if trying to read the truth of his words in the lines around his eyes and mouth. Whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy her, because she nodded slowly. "One day," she said. "Then I go." Fair enough. They finished breakfast in companionable silence, and Samuel found himself oddly reluctant to begin his morning chores. There was something soothing about having another person at his table, even one who spoke little and watched everything. It reminded him of how life used to feel when Margaret was alive, less empty somehow, as if the world had more substance when experienced in the company of another soul. But cattle didn't feed themselves, and fence posts didn't repair their own storm damage. Samuel stood and reached for his hat. "I'll be working around the property today," he said. "Make yourself at home. There's books if you read, and Margaret's sewing basket is still around somewhere if you're handy with a needle." Ayana nodded, then said something that made Samuel pause with his hand on the door latch. "Samuel," she said, using his name for the first time. "Thank you." The words were simple, but the way she said them, with a kind of formal gravity that elevated them beyond mere politeness, made Samuel feel as if he'd received something precious and rare. He spent the morning checking fence lines and discovering that the storm had been harder on his property than he'd initially thought. 3 posts were down along the northern boundary, and there was debris scattered across his best pasture. The work was familiar and satisfying, requiring just enough attention to keep his hands busy while his mind wandered. He found himself thinking about Ayana, not just her presence in his barn and at his table, but the mystery of her. She was clearly educated and well-bred, despite her current circumstances. Her English, though limited, was precise and thoughtful. The way she carried herself spoke of someone accustomed to respect, not someone running from trouble or seeking charity. So what was she doing alone in the middle of nowhere, caught in a storm with nothing but the clothes on her back? Samuel had learned not to pry too deeply into other people's business. The frontier was full of folks with complicated pasts and good reasons for not talking about them. But there was something about Ayana that nagged at him, some sense that her story was more significant than it appeared. He was heading back toward the cabin for the midday meal when he noticed the smoke. At first he thought it might be coming from his own chimney, but the wind was wrong for that. This smoke was coming from the north, beyond his property line, rising in thin grey threads that seemed too organized to be accidental. Signal smoke, maybe, though he hadn't seen Indians use smoke signals in years. Samuel paused at the edge of his yard and watched the distant smoke with growing unease. It could be nothing, travelers making camp, or his neighbor burning brush. But something about the pattern of it, the way it rose and paused and rose again, made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. When he entered the cabin, Ayana was standing at the north-facing window, her body tense with attention. She'd seen the smoke, too. "Friends of yours?" Samuel asked. She turned to look at him, and for the first time since he'd found her, he saw something like fear in her eyes. "Maybe," she said. "Maybe not." Samuel joined her at the window. The smoke was still visible, but fainter now, as if whoever was making it had finished whatever message they were trying to send. "They looking for you." Ayana was quiet for so long that Samuel thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was so soft he had to strain to hear it. "I am daughter of Chief Running Bear," she said. "I was to marry War Chief of Sioux, bring peace between tribes." Samuel felt his chest tighten. A chief's daughter, promised in a political marriage. That explained her bearing, her dignity, her obvious education. "But you ran away," he said. She nodded. 3 days ago. Cannot marry man who killed my brother." And there it was. The reason she was alone in a storm. The reason for the desperate way she'd been traveling. The reason for the smoke signals on his northern horizon. She was nobility, running from duty, and she'd brought her troubles straight to his door. "How many are looking for you?" Samuel asked. Ayana met his eyes. "All of them," she said. The rest of that day passed with the kind of electric tension that precedes a prairie storm, though the skies remained clear. Samuel went about his usual chores, but every few minutes he found himself scanning the horizon for riders or more smoke signals. Ayana stayed close to the cabin, helping with small tasks that didn't require conversation, mending a torn shirt, organizing his sparse pantry, preparing what vegetables remained from his small garden. They were like two people dancing around the inevitable, Samuel thought. Both of them knew that her presence here was temporary, that decisions would have to be made soon. But for now, There was something almost peaceful about the domesticity of it all, the rhythm of shared work, the comfort of another person's presence, the illusion that they could simply continue this way indefinitely. It was an illusion that shattered just before sunset. Samuel was in the barn tending to his horses when Rex began barking with the particular urgency that meant strangers were approaching. But when Samuel stepped outside, rifle in hand, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Riders were coming from the north, but not the handful he might have expected if this was simply a search party. The horizon was dark with mounted figures, dozens of them, maybe more, spread across the prairie, in a formation that spoke of military organization and serious intent. "Jesus," Samuel breathed. Ayana appeared at his elbow, moving so silently he hadn't heard her approach. She studied the approaching riders with the calm assessment of someone who'd been expecting this moment. "My father," she said simply. "All those men for one runaway daughter?" Ayana's smile was bitter. "Not just daughter. Symbol. My marriage was to seal alliance between Cheyenne and Lakota. Without it," she shrugged, but Samuel could read the implications in her gesture. Without the marriage, old enmities would resurface. Blood feuds would resume. People would die. "How'd they find you so fast?" "Tracker named Wolf's Tooth. Best in 3 tribes. Probably followed Storm. Knew I would seek shelter." She paused, watching the distant riders. "He is good man. Will not enjoy bringing me back." The riders were close enough now that Samuel could make out individual figures. The man in the lead sat his horse with the kind of natural authority that marked him as a chief, tall, broad-shouldered, his presence commanding even at a distance. Flanking him were younger men, warriors by their bearing, but also elders who rode with the dignity of council members. This wasn't a raiding party, it was a formal delegation. "What do you want to do?" Samuel asked. Ayana looked at him with surprise. "What I want? You're on my property under my roof. That gives you certain rights as I see it." For a moment something like hope flickered in her dark eyes, followed quickly by resignation. "You do not understand. If I do not go back, they will not leave. And eventually," she glanced at his cabin, his barn, everything he'd built with his own hands. "You have been kind. I will not see kindness repaid with trouble." Samuel was quiet for a long moment, watching the approaching riders and thinking about choices. The ones we make freely, and the ones that get made for us by circumstance and other people's expectations. He thought about his wife Margaret, who'd chosen to marry a dirt-poor homesteader despite her father's objections. He thought about his daughter Emma, who'd never lived to face such choices at all. "Sometimes," he said finally, "the right thing and the easy thing aren't the same." The lead riders were close enough now that Samuel could see the intricate beadwork on their clothing, the eagle feathers in their hair, the paint on their horses. They moved with the fluid grace of people who'd spent their entire lives in the saddle, but there was nothing threatening in their approach. They came openly under the late afternoon sun, with the formal dignity of diplomats rather than the stealth of raiders. The chief, Running Bear, Samuel assumed, raised his hand when they were 50 yards out and the entire party came to a halt. The sudden silence was profound, broken only by the snorting of horses and the creak of leather. Running Bear spoke, his voice carrying easily across the distance. Ayana replied in Cheyenne, her words formal and respectful. The brief exchange ended with the chief nodding once, then dismounting. "He asks permission to approach your home," Ayana translated. "I told him you are good man who showed kindness to stranger." Samuel felt a grudging respect for the protocol being observed. These weren't savages bent on destruction. They were people following their own complex codes of honor and diplomacy. He walked forward, leaving his rifle propped against the fence but keeping his hand near his sidearm. "Chief Running Bear," he said, when they were close enough for conversation. "You're welcome on my land." The chief was younger than Samuel had expected, maybe 45, with prematurely gray hair and eyes that held the weight of difficult decisions. He wore his authority naturally, without the need for bluster or display. When he spoke, his English was careful but clear. "You are Samuel Hayes." It wasn't a question. Samuel wondered what else they'd learned about him in the time it had taken them to track Ayana here. "I am. My daughter speaks well of your kindness." Running Bear glanced toward Ayana, who stood straight and proud despite the obvious tension of the moment. "This is not small thing in these times. Any decent person would have done the same. Running Bear smiled slightly. You think so? Perhaps. But not all men are decent, and not all decent men have courage to act on their beliefs. They stood facing each other across a cultural divide that stretched back generations. The white homesteader and the Indian chief, each representing everything the other's people had been taught to fear and distrust. But Samuel found himself liking this man, recognizing in him the same qualities he'd always respected. Directness, dignity, and the kind of quiet strength that didn't need to prove itself. She says she can't go through with the marriage, Samuel said. And she is right to say so. Running Bear's admission surprised both Samuel and Ayanna. The chief turned to his daughter. You think I do not know why you run? You think I do not see what kind of man Stone Crow has become? Ayanna stepped forward, her voice strained with emotion. Then why? Because sometimes leaders must choose between what their hearts want and what their people need. Running Bear's voice was gentle but firm. Your marriage would bring peace. Without it, old wounds will open, blood will flow, children will die. And what of my blood, my life? Your life belongs to the people as mine does, as it has always been. Samuel watched this exchange with growing understanding. This wasn't about a stubborn father trying to control his daughter's life. It was about the terrible mathematics of leadership, where individual happiness was sometimes sacrificed for collective survival. What if there were another way? Samuel heard himself say. Both Running Bear and Ayanna turned to look at him. What if the alliance could be secured without the marriage? Running Bear's eyes narrowed slightly. You have idea? Samuel was quiet for a moment, an idea forming in his mind. Crazy, probably impossible, but maybe just unconventional enough to work. What Stone Crow wants is prestige, right? Recognition as a great warrior, a man worthy of a chief's daughter. This is true. What if he could gain that recognition another way? A test of strength, of courage, that would prove his worth without requiring Ayanna to sacrifice her life. Ayanna was staring at him now. What kind of test? Samuel looked around at his property, the fence that needed constant repair, the cattle that required daily attention, the 100 tasks that went into making a life on the frontier. A wager, he said, between Stone Crow and myself. The silence that followed was so complete that Samuel could hear his own heartbeat. Running Bear's expression was unreadable, but Ayanna looked horrified. Samuel, no. You do not understand what you are suggesting. Maybe not, but I understand that sometimes the only way out of an impossible situation is to change the rules of the game. Running Bear was studying Samuel with new interest. What kind of wager? Contest of survival. Your tradition, your rules. If Stone Crow wins, he gets what he's always wanted. Proof that he's worthy of alliance through strength. If I win, Samuel looked directly at Ayanna. She goes free. The wind picked up, stirring the dust around their feet and carrying with it the scent of winter coming down from the mountains. In the distance, the rest of Running Bear's men waited in patient silence, but Samuel could feel the weight of their attention, the sense that this moment would echo far beyond the 3 people standing in his yard. And if you lose? Running Bear asked quietly. Samuel met the chief's eyes. Then I reckon that won't be my problem anymore. Dawn came too soon and not soon enough. Samuel had spent the night preparing, checking his weapons, making peace with his god and trying not to think too hard about the fact that he'd just challenged one of the most feared warriors on the northern plains to single combat. The rational part of his mind kept insisting he'd lost his sanity, but a deeper part, the part that had loved Margaret Hayes and buried Emma Hayes and survived 23 years of frontier justice, knew that some things were worth fighting for, even if you weren't sure you could win. Especially then. The camp that had appeared overnight beyond his northern fence was unlike anything Samuel had ever seen. Word of the challenge had spread faster than wildfire, and warriors from both Cheyenne and Lakota bands had ridden in to witness what was being called the test of the white man's heart. Lodges and lean-tos dotted the prairie, cook fires sent thin streams of smoke into the morning air, and Samuel counted at least 200 mounted warriors gathered for what promised to be either a wedding celebration or a funeral, possibly both. Ayanna had barely spoken since he'd made his challenge. She'd spent the night in his cabin, sitting by the window and staring out at the camp lights, her face a mask of emotions Samuel couldn't read. When he'd tried to talk to her about what was coming, She'd simply shaken her head. "You do not understand," she'd said. "Stone Crow has killed 12 men in single combat. He is what you would call berserker. In battle he becomes something else, something terrible." Now, as Samuel walked out to meet his fate, he wondered if she was right. Maybe he didn't understand. Maybe he was about to die for a woman he'd known for less than 3 days, a woman whose people had been at war with his for most of his adult life. Maybe he was the biggest fool who'd ever tried to make a life on the Wyoming prairie. But as he stepped through the gap in his fence and walked toward the circle of warriors that had formed in the flat ground between his property and their camp, Samuel discovered something interesting. He wasn't afraid. Oh, he was nervous. His hands were steady, but his stomach felt like it was full of butterflies and his mouth was dry as old leather. But fear? The kind of bowel-loosening terror that could paralyze a man at the worst possible moment. That was nowhere to be found. Instead, there was only a strange calm, as if this moment had been waiting for him his entire life. Running Bear stood at the center of the circle, dressed in full ceremonial regalia that transformed him from the diplomatic father Samuel had spoken with yesterday into something more ancient and powerful. A chief, not just of men, but of traditions that stretched back to the beginning of time. Beside him stood an older man with intricate scars covering his chest and arms. The medicine man, Samuel assumed, here to ensure that whatever happened would be done according to proper ritual. And across from them, wearing nothing but breechcloth, war paint, and an expression of barely contained violence, stood Stone Crow. Samuel had expected a large man, most fearsome warriors were, but Stone Crow was actually no taller than Samuel himself, maybe 5 feet 10 inches. What made him dangerous wasn't size, but something else, something that radiated from him like heat from a forge fire. This was a man who'd found his purpose in violence, who'd been shaped by war until there was nothing left of him but razor-sharp edges. "Samuel Hayes," Running Bear's voice carried across the circle. "You have challenged Stone Crow to combat for the hand of my daughter. Do you come forward freely of your own will?" "I do. And do you understand that this is a fight to the death, according to the old ways?" Samuel felt his throat tighten slightly, but his voice remained steady. "I do." Running Bear turned to Stone Crow and repeated the questions in Cheyenne. The warrior's response was a snarl of words that needed no translation. Samuel could hear the eagerness for blood in every syllable. "The rules are simple," the medicine man said, speaking English with a formal precision that suggested long practice. "No weapons but what a man carries in his body. No help from others. Fight continues until one man cannot continue, or until one man is dead." The circle of warriors pressed closer, and Samuel could feel their excitement like electricity in the air. Some of these men had ridden for days to see this, drawn by the novelty of a white rancher willing to fight for an Indian woman's freedom. Most of them probably expected him to be dead within minutes. Stone Crow stepped forward, and Samuel got his first close look at the man who wanted to marry Ayanna. The warrior's body was a map of violence, scars from knife wounds, bullet holes, and what looked like claw marks from some large animal covered his chest and arms. His face was painted in red and black stripes that made his eyes look like holes punched in his skull, and when he smiled, Samuel could see that 2 of his front teeth had been filed to points. "White man," Stone Crow said in heavily accented English, "you die today. Then I take woman, and your scalp hangs from my lance." Samuel nodded politely. "We'll see." The medicine man raised his hands and the crowd fell silent. Even the wind seemed to pause, as if nature itself was holding its breath. "Let the test begin," Running Bear said. Stone Crow attacked like a wildcat, all speed and fury and rage. He came in low and fast, aiming for Samuel's legs, trying to bring him down where he could use his superior grappling skills. It was exactly what Samuel had expected. The warrior was used to fighting men who would try to match his aggression, who would let emotion override tactics. Samuel wasn't that man. Instead of meeting Stone Crow's charge, Samuel stepped aside at the last possible moment, letting the warrior's momentum carry him past. As Stone Crow stumbled, trying to recover his balance, Samuel caught him with a solid right hook to the kidney that sent the warrior sprawling in the dust. The crowd roared. Whether in approval or outrage, Samuel couldn't tell. Stone Crow rolled, came up spitting dirt, and charged again. This time Samuel was ready for the feint, saw the warrior try to fake left and go right, and caught him with an uppercut that snapped his head back and sent blood flying from his nose. But if Samuel had thought that would end it, he was mistaken. Stone Crow wiped the blood from his face, smiled that terrible pointed smile, and began to circle like a predator. The fight that followed was nothing like the heroic duels Samuel had read about in dime novels. It was ugly, brutal, and exhausting. Two middle-aged men beating the hell out of each other with fists and elbows and knees, rolling in the dirt like animals, each looking for the opening that would end the other's life. Stone Crow was everything Ayanna had warned Samuel he would be: fast, vicious, and seemingly immune to pain. He absorbed punishment that would have dropped most men and kept coming, his painted face twisted into a mask of savage joy. But Samuel had advantages of his own. 23 years of frontier fighting had taught him that survival mattered more than style, and his time as a widower had left him with nothing to lose and everything to prove. The turning point came when Stone Crow tried to end the fight with a move that had probably worked for him before, grabbing Samuel around the waist and driving him backward toward the edge of the circle, where he could slam him into the ground and finish him with his hands around his throat. But Samuel had seen the move coming, had been watching for it, and as Stone Crow committed to the tackle, Samuel brought his knee up hard. The sound of Stone Crow's nose breaking was audible even over the crowd's roar. The warrior stumbled backward, blood streaming down his face, his eyes watering so badly he could barely see. For the first time since the fight began, he looked vulnerable. Samuel pressed his advantage, moving in with a combination of punches that drove Stone Crow back toward the center of the circle. The warrior tried to cover up, tried to weather the storm, but Samuel had found his rhythm now. Each punch was precise, calculated, designed not just to hurt, but to wear down his opponent's defenses. But Stone Crow wasn't finished yet. As Samuel moved in for what he hoped would be a finishing blow, the warrior suddenly dropped and swept Samuel's legs, sending him crashing to the ground. Before Samuel could recover, Stone Crow was on top of him, his hands closing around Samuel's throat with crushing force. The world began to go gray at the edges. Samuel could hear the crowd screaming, could hear Ayanna's voice calling his name, but it seemed to be coming from very far away. Stone Crow's painted face leered down at him, those filed teeth bared in a snarl of triumph. This was how it ended, Samuel thought dimly. Not with bullets or arrows or any of the dozen other ways a man could die on the frontier, but with enemy hands around his throat, squeezing the life out of him while hundreds of people watched. But then, through the growing darkness, Samuel heard something that gave him strength he didn't know he still possessed. Ayanna's voice, speaking not in English but in Cheyenne, calling something to the crowd. He couldn't understand the words, but he could hear the desperation in them, the fear, the love. That's what this was about, what it had always been about. Not politics or alliances or the complex mathematics of tribal diplomacy, but the simple human right to choose who you gave your heart to. Samuel's hand found a rock in the dirt beside him. With the last of his strength, he brought it up in a short, vicious arc that caught Stone Crow in the temple. The warrior's grip loosened just enough for Samuel to roll free, gasping for air and fighting to stay conscious. Stone Crow shook his head, trying to clear it, blood now streaming from both his nose and the cut on his temple. But he was still dangerous, still deadly, and as he climbed to his feet, Samuel could see in his eyes that he was preparing for one final, desperate assault. Instead, something unexpected happened. Stone Crow straightened, wiped the blood from his face with the back of his hand, and looked directly at Samuel with what might have been respect. "You fight well, white man," he said in English, "but this does not end here." Samuel struggled to his feet, every muscle in his body screaming protest. "No?" Stone Crow glanced toward Ayanna, who stood just outside the circle, with tears streaming down her face. When he looked back at Samuel, his expression had changed. The savage joy was gone, replaced by something harder to read. "I am warrior," he said, "have been warrior since I was boy. No only war, only fighting, only taking what I want by strength." He paused, his chest rising and falling as he fought to control his breathing. "But you fight not for glory or to prove strength. You fight for her choice, for her heart." The crowd had gone completely silent. Even the wind seemed to be listening. Stone Crow turned toward Running Bear and spoke in Cheyenne, a long formal statement that Samuel couldn't understand but whose meaning became clear when Ayanna gasped and covered her mouth with her hands. "He yields," Running Bear announced, his voice carrying a mixture of surprise and pride. Stone Crow acknowledges that true strength lies not in taking what you want, but in protecting what another person values. He withdraws his claim to my daughter's hand. Samuel felt his legs give out, and he sat down hard in the dirt, his head spinning with exhaustion and relief. Around the circle, warriors were talking in low, excited voices, processing what they'd just witnessed. This wasn't how these things usually ended. Ayana broke free from the crowd and ran to him, dropping to her knees in the dust and taking his face in her hands. "You crazy, foolish, wonderful man," she said, switching between English and Cheyenne in her excitement. "You could have been killed, but I wasn't," Samuel managed to say. "And you're free. Free to choose my own path." "That's right," Ayana smiled through her tears. "Then I choose to stay with man, brave enough to fight for woman's right to choose." As the crowd began to disperse and the warriors made their way back to their camps, Samuel Hayes sat in the dirt of his own property and held a woman who'd become more precious to him than all the land in Wyoming territory. Tomorrow there would be questions to answer, papers to file, and the complicated business of building a life that bridged two very different worlds. But today, in this moment, there was only the warmth of another person's arms around him, and the knowledge that sometimes, just sometimes, doing the right thing was also the smart thing. And sometimes, if a man was very lucky, love found a way to bloom even in the hardest ground.